So let me just preface this by saying, first of all, these are interviews that we conducted with PSI students. And so it's not a random sampling at all. It's just like um, people that, again, have had both sort of the transpersonal focus to their psychedelic work, their and as well as sort of the nervous system pathway to their psychedelic work that we work with in PSIP. And they're familiar with they're all mental health professionals or practitioners, and so they're familiar with that realm. Um, and I think that's all I wanted to say about it. Yeah, just and so oh, last thing, we did a lot more interviews than we have time for today. We only have three that we're going to show today, but we're going to host all of the interviews on the PSIP site or the PSI site. And folks, so just ask me to pause whenever you want to sort of comment on anything here. Um,
And Josh, are we saving questions till the end now, or
maybe this is a good time to handle some questions. Gene or Eric, if you have access to them.
I can see them here. Um, there was one about, is it possible to clear all the dissociation in tier one before moving on to tier two, something like that. I'm trying to find it here. Maybe it was in a different. Yeah, does dissociation ever get completely cleared? Can one not really do any tier two work without this as a prerequisite?
I think we're saying it's more complicated to do tier two work with dissociation in place. But that doesn't mean I think 100% of it has to be clear. That I don't see that. I see people clearing enough dissociation. I think people can clear, especially if it's dissociation around the really core developmental pieces of existence. Like, if your system figures out attachment to a decent degree, then I think that, it's a good enough model of, do you have enough cleared? And then the system tends to move towards tier two work, as opposed to, no, we have to have 100% resolution of what's going on at tier one. I don't think that's needed.
And just in the service of like clarity around terminology, I don't think we're clearing dissociation. I think we're clearing traumatic residue, because dissociation is like it's
Uh,
a biological capacity, right? We never lose the capacity to dissociate if we
mhm,
encounter another
mhm.
trauma. So when we say we're clearing dissociation, I feel like more like we're clearing a dissociative residue, that like hasn't cleared through, that's left over from being a kind of activation that helps somebody survive trauma. So I do think we are clearing something about dissociation, but we're not kind of getting rid of the body's capacity to do this
Right.
all important survival mechanism.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
don't
the
think.
dissociation isn't the bad thing that happens
Right,
from
right,
it.
right.
It's actually a very helpful response.
Mhm. I want to throw one more piece out, which is, we're talking about the caution of tier two, and at the same time, I want to just say almost the opposite, which is our bodies are designed for this.
Mm.
So there's an innate resiliency, like our bodies are driven towards, again, accessing that internal interpsychic signal intelligence that is attempting to increase the organism's complexity, increase its capacity to restore order in its life. And so they're like, we can trust in that. So it's kind of holding the dialectic, having caution, and at the same time, our bodies are designed for this.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Jaya. I think that's such an important perspective. Our secondary consciousness is not designed for this. And if you have a form of psychotherapy that's meant to hold on to the ego that gets formed through secondary consciousness, then none of this is going to be good news for you, right? This is going to be challenging to your entire system. But I fully agree with what Jaya just said there, that yeah, our we are like a fish in water when our
Mhm.
primary consciousness knows what to do in these states. So it's like this really profound level of healing that we cannot organize, that we cannot orchestrate ourselves. It's something that we're a process that we're going into, you know?
I
Like,
think what's, oh, sorry,
no,
go
please
ahead.
go ahead.
I think what's missing in our society and education and psychoeducation is um, learning about the signal. Like, and as a result, I think that's the missing piece. If we don't have a society that's actually like devalues this signal, this intelligence, then we can't leverage it to move into these spaces. So again, we want to challenge our thinking, our beliefs around this intelligence that's moving through us, and it's very resilient, and learning about it, deeply learning about it, to because it's there to support us.
Okay. All right, so let's jump into our first video here. Let me pull it up.
There are more questions, but I think we leave those for now.
Yeah, let's pause for a second here. Okay. And okay, there we go. And again, folks, just have me pause whenever you'd like to intervene.
That I just live in a state of terror. I've had insomnia for 30 years. You know, that my system is pretty locked in to fear, and I feel it, you know, emotionally and in my body pretty much all the time. So you know, we were looking to, I think with this particular medicine man, we were looking to kind of expand my consciousness, maybe, you know, it's like a different state of consciousness from which I could experience the terror. And when I was doing the high dose psilocybin work, that I could kind of expand my consciousness into a state of sort of knowing that I was the whole universe, knowing that I was love, you know, knowing that not only was mama in and all, like all around me, but in me, I was made of mama, that like, you know, from this expanded state of consciousness, all this pain and trauma that I was experiencing just got real small. And so, you know, the story I was telling myself prior to PSIP was that if I could just stay with, if I could just kind of hang on to that expanded state, then that was the solution. That, you know, that was the cure. That, you know, even that this pain that I was living in was even a gift, because, you know, it was motivating me in some capacity to realize, you know, to become enlightened, to realize the truth, which is, you know, that I don't exist in this limited concept of myself, you know, that I'm not limited to even to this body, you know, that there's just this great profound bliss and love that happens in this expanded state that is the truth. And so it's still compelling on some level, this idea that I can just transcend all this stuff, or that I can know the truth, right? That like the truth of who I am is this expanded state, you know? And so, you know, if I can just know that, then why would I do all this healing work? And there's this idea that like the healing work is a trap, right? Because there's identity caught in it. So we're thinking that that we're this traumatized human and that we need to heal. And that story maybe is the problem, you know? So then we can just get stuck, you know, in healing indefinitely, because we're identified with the pain in a particular way. And story, I followed teachers and, you know, for years, kind of trying to find the truth of who I really am, you know. And like, so from that lens, I still am a little confused. Well, then why would I go back? And I don't quite know. I mean, you know, I guess like there is this idea that, oh, I mean, what am I here? If I'm just here to become God, like, why am I a human? But, you know, why did I jump into this flesh suit and have all these experiences that were painful, and like, and then there's all these opportunities to heal. Like, I mean, it seems kind of bizarre that we would be having a human experience, but ultimately we're just supposed to be God.
I think the critique from the transpersonal perspective of like, why are you trying to fix this doomed project at all? Yeah.
Because the problem is your identification with your mind and the identification with your problems, and that's the issue. It's not the problem. It's not the trauma. It's that you don't identify as God yet. Eckhart Tolle was a big proponent in in that identifying with God project too. He's so mainstream, and yet that's what he says. Your pain is a gift, because that's the doorway to transcendence. You're going to unglue from your ego because you're in so much pain. Anyway, this teacher that I followed for like a decade probably, who was, kind of a non-dual and taught this, kind of expanded state of consciousness as the solution. Everyone who shared in the group after her talk needed some kind of trauma work. Like, she just wound up telling all these people, do you know about trauma resolution? Seems like you've got trauma. Like, I wanted to refer everybody there to start doing this work, because like nobody seemed to, like, her remedy wasn't the remedy. Actually, it was like a bunch of really, really traumatized people who were showing up so desperate, and wanting to kind of see their challenge through the lens of, this is just a dark night of the soul. The holy is just taking me apart, because ultimately I'm going to be birthed into the truth of, that I don't exist and I'm just love and light, but ultimately it looked like not only did it look to me like, no, these people just needed some real deep healing and support, in terms of like resolving their trauma, but that's what it looked like to her. She was telling them all about how, like, yeah, I don't really do trauma work. You probably should go see it. I thought, like, what are we doing in this song? It was wild. So that was really validating to me, case in point, Yeah, the last thing I'll say about that is that I asked my teacher, because kind of in my own process of exiting that world, or being in the process of exiting that world, I've also gotten more interested in, like, activism in a particular way, and what can I do to make life on this planet better, not just for myself but for other people. And I asked my former teacher, like, are you political at all? Are you interested in making the world a better place? Because that was never part of her teaching, and I noticed a lot of these teachers don't talk about that. And her answer was, that was her response. Like, she was just so honest with me, like, nope, I don't give a shit. I don't care about any of that stuff. Like, really, I'm just doing what the holy just leads me. I don't exist anymore. I just do what the holy leads me to do. I don't even control what comes out of my mouth. Everything I say is just the holy working through me. Like, activism, that's mind. I don't get involved in any of that stuff.
That sounds
so that was
so
also a bit of a red
dissociative.
flag for me. It
I'm
was like, what are we
sorry.
doing here?
Yeah,
I have to say, that sounds so dissociative, what she's describing, this teacher's response. I just had to say that.
yeah.
What are we doing on this planet with all of this pain and suffering if we're actually not supposed to engage and try to make it better? We're just supposed to become enlightened. Anyway, so just last week I had a session with a little bit of cannabis, two, 3 puffs on the vape pen, and yeah, I mean, I would say the cannabis seemed to take me into like.
So what she's turned the corner now, and she's describing the PSIP world, right? So prior to this, it was like this kind of maybe even lifelong, or very most of our adult life, kind of following this non-dual path of transcendent love and light. And now she's describing sort of her experience in the PSIP world with the 2 puffs of cannabis.
To the terror, into the heart of the terror, which is the worst thing that I live with, which is like the worst part of all of it. That's been profound, to have the relational piece, to be able to feel her in my system and have this experience of like profound safety that is concurrent with the terror. They happen at the same time. And that's new. That's not something that was not part of my experience with the psilocybin. And, I didn't have that kind of relational component developed with this medicine man, right? It wasn't on his radar. Like, I think from his point of view, you just, you just give me a bunch of medicine and you trust the medicine. You say a prayer to the medicine. The medicine is what is going to take you where you need to go. Your prayer and the medicine combined, but it wasn't really, I don't think he was looking to like fortify the relationship for the purpose of helping me, move through trauma. That wasn't his role.
Okay.
So can you,
Yep.
she said back there a little bit to be able to feel her in my system. She was referring to the therapist, I assume?
Yeah. Sorry about the edit there. She was referring to her therapist, of finally feeling the presence of her therapist along with along with the terror and everything else that's going on in the system. She felt it felt it side by side.
Yeah. So there's tier one. That's
Yeah.
tier one.
Exactly. Classic PSIP. The nightmare and the relationship, the solution, living side by side, contacting each other. Yeah. And so we have I created just a couple of slides here. Uh, 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 does anybody want to comment on that before we sort of go into a little bit of what the theory can look like of what I think she's describing? Carrie, you had a comment about it.
It was just a outburst. I just wanted, I couldn't hold it in because I mean, just to say that, what's coming out of my mouth isn't me. It's, coming
Yeah.
through me from spirit, and it's disconnected from all trauma and all world and all relationship. I was like, oh, that sounds so dissociative. It's like the opposite of connectivity. It's
Mm,
there's so much kind of pushing away and not seeing and hiding. And I don't know, it just seems like in some ways the embodiment of what we're not recommending, like seeking refuge by bypassing so much of body, world, suffering, pain, humanity to get to some place called spirit. I don't know, it seems like so much amputation.
ah, uh-huh. Yeah.
I do want to just say that, it's not easy for, I think, a lot of people to pull all the pieces apart and have full clarity. I think a lot of people know that of years of therapy about talking about their problem, not solving anything. And so I think it can easily see how that leads to, yeah, the problem is the story. And we need to, if that's not working, then maybe the answer is to just to transcend it all. And it's not like a lot of people out there understand dissociation fully and so on. So I want to hold a broader perspective here. When I hear words like bypassing and so on, I don't think a lot of it is conscious. I think it's people grasping for solutions, because clearly whatever I've been doing isn't working. And so it seems like other people are getting help by psilocybin, ayahuasca. Maybe I'll try that. Yeah, so I just want to throw out that perspective as well.
Yeah.
Mhm. I'm gonna add to what Eric was saying, which is like we grow up with these education systems that it's very linear, black and white. It's mathematics, and we're not teaching children nor adults to think in an integrative way, holding the dialectics, to work with materials that have gray shades of gray. Everything kind of is meant to be linear. That's that secondary consciousness, right? Very linear, black or white, this or that. So looking or developing the brain muscle for integrative thinking isn't, I think we're lacking that in our society, and I think it's being seen in the ways in which we are working with these therapeutic models.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Um, it is interesting to take a look at what's happening here as potentially a function of and I think both Eric, you just mentioned this, and Daniel, you mentioned this earlier, but just lack of solution at a particular level, that like there's just, like, yeah, maybe, we've been in talk therapy for 15 years, and it just seems to be reifying and deepening the groove of, this particular form of identity that we have. And I would actually agree with that. That's not helpful, right? But that doesn't mean the alternative is to necessarily just to then transcend everything, and let go of the entire project of, being a self, which I think is sort of a conclusion that seems to be made often by people. Yeah.
Well, and relational trauma makes attachment so fraught and so scary. So I think for people to kind of garner the courage and surrender to a stronger, older, wiser, therapist who says, I'm gonna help you have solution. I'm gonna help you utilize attachment. I'm gonna guide, right? That or you already have to garner so much courage to jump into that, the chaos of that fear and all the ways that went wrong. And I just think that I understand the tantalizing route of kind of bypassing that, of like, if only there's a way to not have to be that vulnerable, that scared, that confused, that connected, so
Yeah.
I don't judge, I feel a lot of compassion for the fear that makes people want to skip that step, because it is so fraught. And it does
Yeah.
go wrong, even with attachment therapists. Oftentimes it goes so wrong, like enactments, the therapist's own attachment wounding. Like there's just so many ways that can reenact and get perpetuated, and betrayals ongoing and wounding ongoing. So totally get why, if there were a way to avoid it or bypass it, people would want to take that route.
Yeah.
I just don't think it works, right? It's like a fundamental core piece of our humanity, that relationality. So I don't think ultimately full healing can skip that step.
Yeah. And just to clarify around like the bypassing, I think there's many ways that we bypass relationship. If relationship is where the nightmare is, if relationship is where the perpetration is, those things can happen in just like day-to-day life. I think when someone's healing is nested within like group ceremonies, medicine, transpersonal experiences, a common bypassing that happens is spiritual bypassing, because you have the medicine, you have the culture that surrounds it. But within like normal containers, like we could bypass this through our minds and just kind of escape from the relationship, right? Or
Totally.
we could go into some form of self-regulation through meditation rather than trying to resolve it in a relationship. So there's many pathways, and I think most of the time it is unintentional, like what Eric was touching on. And I think even if someone is intentionally trying not to spiritual bypass in certain containers, if there's not the container and enough solution to move towards a different pathway, I think a lot of the times the system will still take that route because there's no other option to take, right? So in no way are we criticizing or like shaming people for taking that pathway. That's just an alternative to something that might be more beneficial or effective if the container was set up to support that.
That's where the dyadic states of consciousness are so important, because people don't realize that they're bypassing. They're just surviving, right? They're just doing the best they can to keep a fragile sense of equilibrium in their systems, right? And so they need someone who's like taking a step back or coming from a more expanded state of consciousness to be like, when you do that, this is happening, or you're staying stuck, or because I think a lot of therapy can be a bypass, right? It can just be a big collusion of staying in defensive habitual systems. So I think it's what we're talking about is so nuanced and so tricky, and it's not about categories. It's so much about functionality, right? Because you can have therapeutic bypass as much as you can have spiritual bypass. I think if the ultimate question is, are we coming toward more wholeness, more connectivity, more inclusivity, relationally, intrapsychically, with the dissociated material? Is the nervous system coming back online? Is it coming back to wholeness? Is it coming back to regulation? These are like dynamic processes. They're not, in a way, they're not categorical.
Yeah.
Just reminding. Go ahead, Sash.
Go ahead, Joy.
It's reminding me of a personal story of when with my ex-husband, and he actually had he had more of an attachment. I had less capacity to attach, so extreme disorganized attachment and avoidance, dismissive avoidance, and he was like further along in some ways. And I remember when we would get into these places where he would want that attachment, and my system, I had been doing so much my own work, like I was so tenacious, I was like a therapy junkie, and in those moments I would like go into my holier than thou transcendent place of like non-attachment and think that I was somehow doing it right, and like, and so there was this like incredible, like now I'm just like gut wrenching at my own, like so much remorse over that. But it just shows like someone, I mean, I am diligent, I have been diligent my whole life on working on my stuff, but we just don't know, we don't, we're stumbling through this together. So
We
I
can't
think
see
what
the
we're talking about is avoidance here, right? Different pathways, different very subtle pathways of avoidance. And I think somebody in the chat, which is, my God, people, it's such a rich chat conversation going on. And but somebody in there was talking about, well, how does meditation play into this? And I think it's just like everything else we're talking about here, that it can become a tool of detachment, of stepping away from being you and being a fully experiencing being here, and it can also be a pathway for entering more into existence, like bypassing mind and all the like the layers that actually keep us from fully being here. So it's subtle, right? Yeah. um okay, wow, all right, so let's just maybe I'm gonna do it. So we have roughly a half an hour. So for Eric and Daniel, because you two have seen both the videos and then the remaining couple of slides, what's your sense about what would be most useful for the for the call?
Go ahead, Daniel.
I definitely have a lean for those slides. Yeah, I
Oh,
think that would be
okay.
to cover.
Well, that's clarity, and I can go with that. All right, let's do a share.
I think maybe there's a part two to this as well, because the last interview is very powerful. The last interview gives a very good example of what can go wrong when you're in the wrong context for trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with you on that. Yeah. The last piece really touches on the container, the variation in containers, and
Yeah. All right, so this is where we ended. And obviously, what we're doing in the PSIP world is really this focus on tier one, simply because we think that it's not being addressed much in the psychedelic world. But here's, I think, what we just saw, sort of what the interviewee was discussing. So here we have just, imagine the circle being the totality of somebody's self, their ego structure, right? So basically, this is a trauma-filled self, right? So the majority of it, you can see, is filled with developmental wounding, complex PTSD, biological compromise of the nervous system, dissociation, that kind of the tier one trauma world here. And then maybe there's some sliver of the self that exists here, that's stable, it's non-reactive, and this person's able to be functional insofar as they're able to spend more and more time in the stable non-reactive self, even though there's a whole lot of them that lives in trauma. So basically what we're suggesting here is that you get this ego structure with these little trauma bubbles all around, and potentially the transpersonal movement is more like this, right? So in other words, in this picture, what's happening is that, well, the transpersonal processes, or we're suggesting one direction that the transpersonal processes can take people is to have a greater identification with a much larger self, right? We're no longer talking about just your individual self, but this kind of much larger unity consciousness of everything. In which case, the trauma self becomes much smaller, right? The developmental wounding, the dissociation, the biological compromise, it's taking up much less of the self than, and there's a whole lot more room for somebody to navigate, for them to hang out in this transpersonally resourced, stable self here. Yeah. So that, to me, this is what the last interviewee was describing, sort of, sort of this movement from here, like your small human self, very limited space where you can navigate and be stable, to here, which is a much larger transhuman self, but much more potential stability. This is, you can have a great deal of love and light and operate in that realm, and have sort of the human realm being smaller on this scale. All right. So any thoughts on any of that before we?
Sadly, I have to sign off.
Oh,
I
okay.
want to stay for more, but I have family duties calling in the background. So thank you so much, everyone, for this rich and really enlightening conversation. I loved it. Hope there's a part 2.
Yeah. Thank you, Carrie. Anytime you're a part of one of these, we end up having a part 2.
I know.
Yeah,
I think I'm just not good at being efficient and terse. I like the long, nuanced,
a
complex.
long form. Yeah,
I don't think it's me. I think it's a lot of us. We like
it's true.
to hang out in nuance.
Can't pin it on you. Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, okay. So I thought that was just maybe a good visual representation of what that one of the pathways that, so in that picture that we just saw, the trauma is not being processed, right? Let's be very clear about that. The trauma is not being engaged with, it's not being processed, it's not being identified with. In fact, what's being identified with is a much bigger self. It's a much bigger you. And so I think that's, we can call that bypassing, and that's one of the pathways that I think the transpersonal works in a system, in a traumatized system.
And one thing to touch on with that last piece with the transpersonal resourcing stable self, I think when someone does move in that direction, there's a tendency to create more distance from the self, which creates more distance from the humanity as well as the trauma, right? Like that's one of the like benefits of moving in that way, right? Further from the self, but further from the trauma, further from the wounds, until there's like a need to be more of the self, which tends to happen when you want to relate and have a lot of intimacy and connection on a human level.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really helpful to keep in mind too that over a few million years we evolved in close groups, being held, being strapped to get to our caregivers, sleeping together, having, a deep sense of belonging, connection. Of course, there were problems and so on, but there wasn't, I don't think, the level of attachment trauma going on for a lot of our evolution that there is now. We are in a whole different paradigm where there's a lot of attachment trauma, and so we're taking a healing medicine from a culture that it wasn't meant for attachment trauma. I think traditionally it was only the shaman who would take, I don't know that for sure, but I've heard that kind of thing, which makes a lot of sense to me. The shaman would take the medicine when there was something off in the community. The shaman had incredible training for that and so on. So, we're dealing with a whole different kind of thing here than what we've dealt with for eons of human evolution.
That's such a good perspective to take in around this, right? That this is the conditions that we find ourselves in are really, really modern, are really, really just, the last 2 minutes of human existence. That's what we're looking at here.
Yeah, I'd say I've observed the same thing. I was part of a Lakota the Lakota ways, Native American ways, for about 8 years, and noticed that it didn't quite work as well, because I mean the Sundance rituals, the sweat lodges, all the things that they do to access that transpersonal realm was done in the context of community, very tight knit tribal communities, right? That held them together. The fabric, the rituals, the day, everything they did on a day-to-day basis held them together to hold that sort of transpersonal kind of dimension or channel. And so they were both in this relational and in the transpersonal, holding that dialectic. And what I witnessed is it didn't have the same, it didn't stick, as sort of modern people came and started us attempting to recreate that. At least that was my personal experience.
Mhm, mhm.
Especially with what you touched on, Eric, right? Around the attachment trauma being more severe in modern society. And it's like if we're moving into group containers, like in a more communal sense, what's necessary in order for community to be supportive for an individual rather than just more threat, right? Like if there is severe attachment trauma and one individual has a lot of perpetration, then adding more people within to the community and going into transpersonal space, I don't know how helpful that would be for that person.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. This is the most beautiful containment I think is possible, right? You have like if you have like a transpersonal, strong transpersonal with a strong relational connection, both of those tethers, and that's your container that we see in the tribal communities. Then if someone gets traumatized, there's just so much more capacity for the individual to move through whatever's there.
Mhm. Well, that's interesting because I mean, we've talked about it. I don't know if we'll, I guess potentially we could show it, but the last interview here is of somebody that did have, a lot of individual trauma that moved into a much more ceremonial container, and it did not have any of the relational components that she felt she needed to sort of hold what was coming up in her system, right? So, in other words, I think the two pathways, and that, this is just maybe my limited experience talking here, but the two pathways are either this sort of identification with a much larger self that's happening, or these big medicine experiences do in fact turn towards the trauma. They head into it, they're starting to unfold it, the reenactments are happening, the people are going back to the scene of the crime, as it were, in their medicine sessions, but then there's not the pillar of the relationship to sort of help ground it and hold it, um, and and that's when we really see very scary things tend to happen, or very complicated things that people report come back and they're more disintegrated. They feel groundless. I mean, we've heard stories in some of these interviews of people, you know, months and years of somebody's life that they're spending now in some kind of some door has been opened up, but the process wasn't well held, and so they didn't make it to the other side.
I think maybe I'm saying that exactly what you're saying. So
Yeah,
maybe how I articulated it wasn't, yes. So I would say yes, 100%.
yeah. I was saying that to kind of give a more backup to what you were describing, Jaya. Yeah.
Got it.
Saj, would it be possible to show that last one? Because we're
Yeah.
kind of like
Yeah.
and a
Mhm.
handful of people that definitely want to see this on the chat.
All right, sure. Let's go ahead and do that. And again, we're going to make not just these three, but other ones that of these interviews that I did, because they're all rich gems. They're all these people really being sort of vulnerable and honest and open about their experiences. And some of them, are just to be clear, folks, when we go into these interviews, I basically tell people, if they've had these transpersonal experiences dealing with their trauma and it worked beautifully well, I really want to hear that, right? I would love to have that represented. And I think what, generally speaking, we're getting a much more complicated picture of what this all looks like. So yeah, let's go ahead and do that share. Rachel, my apologies for skipping over you for this one, but we're gonna go to, okay.
I went to South America for a 2-week ayahuasca retreat, and I went with actually people who I know. I'd actually worked with a couple of the facilitators previously. Like in my sense of it was that I felt really good going into it, because I felt like I'd done a lot of homework, about where I was going, and the people were not new to me. I've never had this big of an ayahuasca experience before. I mean, I was high within, like 20 minutes. Like, it was very fast, very, rocket ship experience. And what I understand now that I didn't know when it was happening is that what happened is it opened up an event memory, actually 2 event memories for me, both which were near-death experiences. One of which involved a concussion. So my experience of it was, something is wrong. I thought I was having a medical emergency. I felt like I was like paralyzed, like my body was heavy. And actually I later described it as like, I felt like I did when I had a concussion, which now I understand that that's exactly what was opening up. I lost my vision. I couldn't see. Like, I mean, I was having a full-blown event memory, but not knowing I was having an event memory. And
Okay, I'll just pause here for a second. And folks, let me just say, if you are not familiar with the PSIP world and that kind of training, which I know a fair amount of you are not, this is incredibly normal. That when people are going into medicine space and they have trauma, and the process, the medicine is interested in taking us back to the event that happened. And so what she's describing here is, having had 2 near-death experiences, one that involved a very severe concussion that she had, disorientation, inability to move, paralysis when it actually happened. And so she's describing being in the ayahuasca ceremony and it opening the door to that event memory. And so she started physically and cognitively experiencing all the things that she was experiencing when the near-death experience happened. So that's what she's saying. Like, she didn't, in retrospect, especially after doing the PSI training, she's seeing it in that context. But when this was happening, she had no idea that that's what was happening. She wasn't expecting it. She wasn't prepared for it. Again, this is a therapist. This is a very competent therapist, and she had no idea that, so when the medicine brought on the reenactment of that traumatic event, that her system was going to go there so thoroughly, and such a thorough regression back to that place, right? So just giving a little context around it.
facilitators also did not know that that's what was happening. I was revisiting this trauma, and I didn't know, and they didn't know. I ended up in the middle of the Maloka floor, like if people would try to leave me to like go get additional help. I mean, I was like crawling. I mean, it was pure terror, right? Like, I thought I was dying, so I was like crawling after them, and I was in the middle of the Maloka for at least an hour, maybe longer, and I was stuck in a trauma loop. So my internal experience was that. I mean, I completely lost all sense of who I was. I had no idea where I was. I mean, it was just mass confusion. It was like someone hit the reset button in my brain, and I didn't, I would have momentary awareness of my body and realize that I was a human again, and that the present moment was happening. And I would start crying and saying, like, why is no one helping me? Because I have no vision. I can't see. I actually have no awareness that anyone is around me, because in this ayahuasca tradition, the shamans are not allowed to touch the participants. And so this ceremony became a massive trauma reenactment for me. I was essentially reliving 2 near-death experiences, like 2 linked traumas. And in fact, the thing that finally brought me out of it is the shaman did actually finally touch me.
Okay.
And when he touched me, it like snapped me back, and I suddenly was like, I like was able to sit up for the first time, because before that my body felt so heavy. I really didn't feel like I had the capacity to move. I basically come back to, and he says to me, okay, you're better now. Go back to your mat. And I didn't even know what a mat was. I mean, this is how disintegrated I became in that ceremony. I actually didn't remember when my best friends was, you know, there with me. I couldn't remember her name. I mean, you know.
Again, folks, I just want to remind you, when somebody has a concussion at the level that this person did, your mind is not working. The way that you're forgetting people, you don't know, like, really, really basic things about yourself in the world. And that's what is emerging right in the middle of this process for her.
Anyways, I was in quite a disintegrated space, and then was
Wow.
told to, you know, go back to where I was. I couldn't feel my body. I didn't know, I was so far out. It's almost like the physical touch was the tether, you know, into the present reality. And one of the shamans came and sat with me, and again, she came to me and she held my hand, and I just start sobbing. Yeah, but then she was like, well, I'm gonna sing to you. And then she turned her hand, and then she removed her hand, you know. So again, like the relational touch, that's all I needed, you know. I didn't need a song sung to me. I didn't, and I think that that's where this container, it just was not the right container for me to revisit these specific traumatic experiences, because I really needed a relational container to revisit what I would say might be like two of the most terrifying moments in my life. But, you know, I needed a lot of help after that happened. That was so scary. I mean, I was absolutely terrified. It was brought back to the terror of almost dying, you know, in my, like, previously in my life, but I literally thought it was happening again in that ceremony, you know, and the lack of relational support was super hard for me. You know, they were like, oh yeah, this like just happens. It also kind of felt like a war story. Like, oh, we've all had these experiences where we've been in the middle of the Maloka floor, and you know, it's like rough, and like this is how ayahuasca is, you know, like it's just but none of that felt like
Oh.
the concussion thing. It happened again the last night. It was, I mean, I was absolutely terrified. It was brought back to the terror of almost dying, you know, in my, like, previously in my life, but I literally thought it was happening again in that ceremony, you know, and the lack of relational support was super hard for me. You know, they were like, oh yeah, this like just happens. It also kind of felt like a war story. Like, oh, we've all had these experiences where we've been in the middle of the Maloka floor, and you know, it's like rough, and like this is how ayahuasca is, you know, like it's just but none of that felt like.
I don't know why it's doing that.
The concussion thing, it happened again the last night. It was
Ah.
paralyzed and blind.
Let me see here.
Whole night, and I kept asking for help.
I don't know why it's doing this. Let me see if I can troubleshoot that, if you guys want to talk about it for a little bit.
Yeah, I've watched it, so, and Daniel, I'm sure you can chime in too, but one of the things she goes on to say is how destabilized she was coming back home and how fortunate she was to have really good support, the therapy support and so on to manage the level of destabilization she came home with. And then she acknowledges, not everybody does. So that's I think where she goes on to from there.
Mhm.
I'm just going to name that we are almost at 2 hours, and I just want to like maybe we don't show the rest of the video if we're running this late. Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
maybe that's fine. It's useful, but yeah, let's do that. And
Point was well made with even just that amount. Yeah.
yeah, it gives you a sense of what's going on. And again, we'll release it, so you'll have access to it. Okay, and folks, I know there's a lot of questions here and everything, so maybe we can do that thing that we've done before in other workshops where we just we go through all of the webinar chat, and we just pull out the questions that people have, and then we can get together and just do a quick filming of on Zoom of us talking about the questions that people have, and then we just release that kind of separately. We've done that before, and I think that seems to work pretty well for folks. So everyone, even though we're running out of time here, if you do have more questions that you would like us to handle in a future video, just pop them in the webinar chat, and then we'll make sure to um, to address it, all of them. Yeah. Anything else from anybody else on the panel? Anything that you felt like you wanted to get to that we didn't?
Wish I would have had this when I was doing ayahuasca. I really, really feel so good to be a part of this and talk about these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
would love to have a whole other this is very fun. I actually quite like this. I'd like to have a whole other like discussion just on the signal, on this intelligence, and really bringing it to light and helping people understand it, and where does it belong in our society, and how do we work with it in day-to-day lives, and how is it useful? It's useful to support us in healing trauma. It's useful to support us in innovating with a moral integrity to it. I mean, there's so many ways in which if we access a signal, it can be dramatically shift the way humanity works and functions. And so I would love to have a topic on that.
Yeah. And folks, if you're on this call and you don't know what Jaya is referring to when she's talking about the signal, then just stay connected with us. It's a very powerful, very real thing. It's not nuanced, it's not subtle. If you go to the PSI website and go to our video resources, you'll see it all over the place there. Uh, Yes, we will email everybody on the call. We have the chat history, as well as if you've registered for this webinar, so we can email you when we have that follow-up video. And you'll get access to it. We'll just put it on Vimeo or YouTube or something like that. Great. Daniel, anything from you as we're wrapping up?
I would love to see a part 2 for this. Yeah.
I know, right? It feels so rich. It feels like there's so much that we didn't actually get to touch on today. But so let's really consider that. Let's consider maybe doing a part 2 to this. And folks, I think that maybe just a summary of where we're leaving things off right now is that, these are incredibly powerful processes and medicines that we have access to. Um, you know, and I think that we're starting to say we have to look at other elements of the container. We have to look at relationship. We have to look at the pathway that the medicine is taking through a person. There's so many sort of other components to sort of what leads to really, positive outcomes with these medicines. They're not guaranteed, right? You have a lifetime of wounding and dissociation and psychological defenses going on, you taking a psychedelic medicine is not going to make all of that magically go away, right? So I think the one big takeaway is let's let go, relax some of sort of the magical savior projections that we can tend to have on medicine and these processes. They take work. This is work from on your side and on the side of the person that you're working with. And it's just like, we're not simple. These processes are not simple, right? So I think we can just kind of let go of the simple solutions to complex problems. Okay, all right, wonderful, everyone. Thank you so much. Again, just keep putting your questions into the chat, and we will get to them. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being on the call, and we'll talk to you later. Okay, bye-bye.